My name is Carly. I'm 27. Last week, my mom surprised me with a birthday dinner at a retro diner. I walked in expecting awkward small talk and a couple of backhanded comments. I did not expect my own birthday cake to be the joke. After we ate, the server came out holding a sheet cake. Everyone turned toward me, phones up, already grinning. For 3 seconds, I let myself believe my mom had actually done something kind. Then I saw the writing on the cake. In big pink letters across the center, it said, "Oops, still a disappointment." There was a beat of silence, like the air forgot what to do. Then the whole table exploded in laughter. My mom clapped like it was the funniest thing she had ever seen. My little brother almost spit out his drink. Someone yelled, "Come on, it's just a joke." I stared at those words sitting in the frosting like they'd been waiting years to be said out loud. I did not cry. I did not scream. I pushed my chair back, picked up my bag, and stood up. My mom told me to sit down and take a joke. I didn't even look at her. I turned toward the exit. My uncle stepped in front of me, hand on my arm, telling me not to make a scene. I leaned in like I was about to apologize and whispered one sentence in his ear. 2 days later, my entire family was in full-blown panic, and none of it was about the cake. If you're into messy family drama and quiet revenge that hits where it really hurts, you can stick around, hit like, and subscribe so you don't miss how this all unfolds. The diner looked like a set from an old movie. Red vinyl booths, chrome edges, neon script buzzing over the counter. I walked in with that familiar weight in my chest, the kind that came whenever my family staged a nice gesture, and I was expected to play along. My mom, Sharon, had claimed a corner booth as if she were headlining a show. She sat with perfect posture, fingers around a sweating glass, eyes tracking me the way someone checks a receipt for mistakes. My dad, Gregory, sat beside her with his shoulders drawn in, wearing the resigned look of a man who planned to let the evening pass without stepping in. Across from them, my younger brother Dylan lounged with his phone in hand, recording short clips, his attention fixed on the screen more than on me. Sliding into the booth felt less like sitting down to dinner and more like stepping back into a role I thought I had outgrown. Sharon took in everything at once: my clothes, my hair, the way my hands picked at the paper-wrapped straw. Her comments floated across the table, sounding casual, but each one carried a small sting. Gregory stayed mostly neutral. Dylan kept lifting his phone whenever laughter rose, angling his lens toward me as if he were waiting for an expression worth posting. The food arrived in heavy plates and baskets. Burgers sagged, fries left grease on the table, milkshakes sweated under fluorescent lights. Conversation drifted toward my job search and the future I apparently wasn't moving toward fast enough. Sharon mentioned people my age with solid careers and neat timelines, then let the silence between examples do the work. No one used the word failure, but it hung there anyway. I watched my reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser. Tired circles under my eyes, a polite half-smile that never reached them. I didn't look like someone being celebrated. I looked like someone being evaluated. I felt that tiredness settle along my shoulders, but under it something calmer, colder, stayed in place and kept watching. Servers moved through the aisles, topping off drinks and clearing plates. Sharon seemed to grow brighter as the table emptied, as if the performance were building toward a final act. She glanced toward the counter more than once, and each glance tightened something in my chest. When most of the plates were pushed aside and the noise in the diner had fallen into a low hum, I saw the server nod toward our booth and vanish behind a swinging door. Dylan straightened, phone ready. Gregory rubbed his palms on his jeans, expectant. I sat very still, feeling the air around us change in a way the lights didn't explain. The server came back carrying a sheet cake on a plastic tray, candles flickering as she walked. Conversations at nearby tables dipped as people turned to look. The cake landed in front of me, frosting wobbling around the edges. For a moment, I let myself hope the message would be harmless, something bland and forgettable. Then I read what they had chosen to have written above my name. The reaction was instant and loud, a burst of laughter that wiped out whatever the jukebox was playing. Sharon pressed her hand to her chest in delight. Dylan lifted his phone higher to catch every second. Gregory watched me with the cautious interest of someone waiting to see if a glass will shatter. Sitting there under cheap neon with that message staring back at me from the icing, I understood I wasn't misreading them or overreacting. This wasn't a slip or a joke that went too far. It was how they wanted to define me, paid for and presented on a plastic tray. A few months before that birthday, I spent a Saturday back at my parents' house doing what they called a quick favor. My dad's back was acting up, and he needed help clearing out the small room he used as an office. In his mind, I had free time and working arms, which made me the obvious choice. I followed him down the hallway past my old bedroom and into a space that looked like it had been holding its breath for years. The office was more storage closet than workspace. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, and loose papers sagged on top of a filing cabinet. My dad pointed to a cluster of boxes he wanted moved to the garage, then lowered himself into a chair with the stiff movements of someone pretending they were fine. I started dragging boxes toward the door. Most of what I saw when I opened them was exactly what I expected. Old tax returns, brittle warranty booklets, envelopes from banks with logos I barely recognized filled the folders. It felt like sifting through the paper version of background noise, all the boring proof that a family had kept existing year after year. I kept working until I reached a heavier box pressed into the corner. Inside, the folders were lined up in neat rows, each one labeled in my dad's careful handwriting. Near the back, one folder stood out. The cover was cream instead of manila, the corners rounded from being handled. My name was written across the front in blue ink, and under it, in smaller letters, was the word education. For a moment, I just held it and listened to my heartbeat pick up. Then curiosity won. The first pages were forms from an investment company. My grandfather, Donald, was listed as the person who opened the account, his slow, shaky signature at the bottom of the document exactly the way I remembered it from birthday cards. The description was simple: money set aside for my college expenses. The early account statements showed regular deposits going in on a schedule, small amounts at first, then larger ones as the pages flipped forward. The balance climbed line by line, a quiet record of someone building a safety net under the version of me they hoped would exist someday. For a second, I could almost see that imaginary future, the one where I walked onto campus without a knot of panic about how to pay for it. Halfway through the stack, the rhythm broke. Deposits stopped. Withdrawal slips appeared in their place. Large amounts left the account in uneven chunks, sometimes only weeks apart. The names on the lines changed too. My mom's on some pages, my Uncle Keith's on others, next to vague notes about family needs and temporary help that could mean anything or nothing. By the final statement, the balance was almost gone and the account was closed. The date landed just before the year I sat at our kitchen table filling out financial aid forms and being told there was nothing saved, that we were all doing the best we could, and I would have to piece the rest together myself. Sitting on the carpet with that folder open across my legs, I felt old conversations tilt out of alignment. There had been money once. It simply never reached me. My hands felt unsteady, but my thoughts were clear. I took out my phone and quietly photographed every page in the folder, one after another, until my camera roll held a full copy of a story no one had ever told me. Then I stacked the papers exactly as I had found them, slid the folder back into the box, and closed the lid before carrying it downstairs. On the drive home, my bag sat heavy on the passenger seat, my phone inside it holding proof that my family had not just mishandled my feelings. Long before a cake spelled it out, they had already spent my future. The days after my birthday settled into a deliberate quiet. I shut my phone off when I got home and let the apartment stay still. I went to my temporary job, came back to my small place, cooked simple food, and moved through each evening without the vibration of other people's reactions in my hand. It felt less like hiding and more like finally stepping outside a room where I had been on trial for years. In that silence, my thoughts slowed enough to line up. I remembered my mother brushing off my plans as unrealistic, my father staring at the table when someone took a joke too far, my brother repeating stories about how I was always behind. None of that was new. What changed was the sentence on the cake tying those moments together. Once I had seen it written out, it stopped being possible to pretend they meant anything kinder. On the second evening, I turned my phone back on. The screen filled with missed calls, voicemails, and message previews. My mother's name appeared again and again, followed by my father, my Uncle Keith, and Dylan. Long threads of texts and a few emails waited. Skimming through them was enough. My mother framed the dinner as support I had misunderstood and leaned on the idea that she had sacrificed too much to deserve this distance. My father urged me to talk before things went too far. Keith focused on my reaction, as if leaving had been the real offense. Dylan tried to treat the whole thing as a joke we would eventually laugh about. I did not answer any of them directly. I wrote one short message in the family thread stating that I knew about the college fund my grandfather had opened for me, that I had copies of the account paperwork and statements, and that I would not be handling it through text. There was nothing dramatic in those lines, just the fact that the secret in their file box was no longer invisible. When the message sent, the quiet that followed felt heavier but steadier, like a floor that had stopped shifting even if the room was still dark. Not long after, a name lit up my screen that almost never did. My Aunt Elaine lived several states away and usually stayed on the edge of family gatherings, close enough to be polite, but far enough to avoid being pulled into every argument. Her call carried a different weight from the others. She had spoken with her daughter, my cousin Riley, who had already heard the birthday story through relatives who never let anything stay quiet. In that version, I was the dramatic one, walking out over a harmless joke and throwing around accusations about money I did not understand. Somewhere in that game of retelling, my whispered comment to Keith had turned into a rumor. Sitting on my couch, I told Elaine about the folder in my father's office, the account labeled for my education, the steady deposits that stopped, the withdrawals signed by my mother and my uncle, the dates that mirrored the years I signed loan papers. Saying it out loud turned scattered numbers into a line of cause and effect. Elaine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she admitted that small remarks from my grandfather years earlier had made her think something had been saved for me, but she had convinced herself she was mistaken because my parents never spoke as if it existed. Hearing the details forced her to look at that gap. She asked me to send what I had. I opened my laptop, pulled up the email where I had stored the images and documents, and attached every file to a message addressed to her. Watching the progress bar move across the screen, I realized how long I had been gripping that knowledge alone. When the email finally left my outbox, the evidence no longer lived only on my phone and in my memory. The weight of what my family had done shifted slightly away from being a secret I carried and toward something that could, at least in theory, be held up to the light. The email from Elaine with the lawyer's name felt different from everything my family had sent so far. It was short and practical, with no guilt woven into the lines. She wrote that what I had found matched things my grandfather once hinted at, and that this was bigger than a misunderstanding. She knew someone who handled situations where money meant for one person quietly ended up in someone else's account. The lawyer's office was small and neat, tucked above a coffee shop downtown. He glanced at the stack of papers I brought and asked me to explain them before he read anything. I laid out the story in order, from the labeled folder in my dad's office to the closed account, then the student loans and years of payments that followed. Saying it like that made my own life sound like a case file. He read through each page with steady attention, checking names, dates, and account numbers without comment. To him, the college fund was not a favor. It was an account with a clear purpose and a named beneficiary. The withdrawals were not mistakes, but deliberate transfers that never touched tuition or housing. In plain language, he said there were formal ways to demand that money back, along with the growth it should have earned. Hearing those words unsettled me and settled me at the same time. I had always left room for the idea that there was some emergency or confusion I had not known about. Now, an outsider was looking at the same numbers and calling them misuse without hesitation. It was both grounding and quietly devastating to realize my mother and Keith had seen my name on that account and still emptied it. When he asked whether I wanted to move forward, the answer was already sitting behind my ribs. I thought of the years of juggling rent and minimum payments, of my mother still talking about me as if I were lazy and ungrateful. Walking away would have meant choosing their comfort over my future again. I told him I wanted to take whatever steps were necessary. Those steps looked simple on paper. He requested official records from the investment company and the bank, so nothing rested solely on the copies I had found. He prepared a letter to my mother and Keith, stating that their use of the fund was under review and that documents tied them to every withdrawal. He copied Elaine so at least one other adult in the family saw the situation in formal language instead of sentiment. As soon as those letters landed, the tone of the family group chat shifted. The usual stream of jokes and photos was pushed aside by long messages about loyalty and keeping problems inside the family. My mother wrote about feeling attacked and insisted that everything she had done was for us. My father tried to calm everyone from the sidelines, but his messages sank without changing anything. Dylan added vague comments about drama that did not use my name, but clearly pointed at me. In the middle of that noise, my cousin Riley started asking questions. She wanted to know when the account had been opened, who had access to it, and why I had never been told it existed while I signed loan papers. She did not attach the documents she had seen, but every question hinted that there was more evidence than my parents were admitting. No one answered her directly. They dodged, shifted the subject, and circled back to my attitude instead of the money. Watching all of this unfold on my phone felt sharp and unreal. For years, whenever I challenged the way my family treated me, it turned into a lecture about how sensitive I was. Now someone else in the same thread was tracing the same cracks without apologizing. While the chat kept spinning, the lawyer sent a brief update confirming that the official statements matched my copies and that we had enough to demand repayment. It did not erase my debt, but it shifted where the weight of the story sat. For once, I was not the only one holding it. The next turning point showed up at my door, not in my notifications. It was a slow, careful knock on a weeknight when the building was already quiet, and my brain was somewhere between exhausted and numb. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the handle, knowing that whoever was on the other side was not here to make this easier. Avoiding them had never changed what they did. It had only delayed when I had to face it. My mother was in the hallway, coat half-buttoned, hair pulled back too tight, like she had rushed out before she could talk herself into staying home. The overhead light in the corridor made her look sharper, less soft-focused than she liked to appear. For years, seeing her at my doorstep would have felt like rescue. That night, it felt like the past trying to push its way back in. I opened the door, but I did not step aside. She walked into my apartment as if it were a room she had the right to inspect. Her eyes skimmed over the second-hand couch, the wobbly table, the stack of bills on the counter. Nothing about the space matched the picture she had always held up as a successful adult life. I could feel her turning every object into evidence that I still needed the kind of guidance she believed only she could give. For once, I let that judgment land and did nothing to soften it. She started talking in a tone she reserved for doctors and school principals, the polished voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. She said she was worried about me, that she did not understand how a birthday dinner had turned into distance and legal papers. She framed everything as a misunderstanding made bigger by my hurt feelings. The cake and the words on it vanished from her version, replaced by vague references to jokes that had gotten out of hand. In the story she told, I had taken things too seriously and dragged strangers into family business. When she finally mentioned the money, it was almost an afterthought. The fund became something that had been sitting there during hard years, another resource to pull from when she and my Uncle Keith were trying to keep everyone afloat. The withdrawals turned into difficult choices, the kind any parent would make. My name on the documents, my plans for school, the loans I had signed to cover what was supposedly not there, all of that slid to the edges of her explanation. She wanted me to see sacrifice where I saw a promise quietly emptied. Sitting across from her, I could feel two realities pressing against each other. One was printed in black ink on statements from an investment company, showing contributions intended specifically for my education and a balance that had drained away long before I filled out my first financial aid form. The other lived entirely in her mouth, a narrative where necessity excused everything and gratitude was the only acceptable response. In the past, I would have tried to find a middle ground between those two things. Now I understood there was not one. There was no apology buried in her words. What I heard instead was fear dressed up as concern. Fear of being judged by people who did not share our last name. Fear of losing the stability that money had helped buy. Fear that the version of herself she presented to the world might crack. She never said she was scared of court, but every sentence bent in that direction. She wanted me to pull back before a judge saw what I had found. She wanted this to stay in the dark corners where family secrets usually live. When I told her I was not withdrawing anything and that I intended to follow through with the process already in motion, the room felt strangely still. I did not raise my voice or list every time she had cut me down to keep herself standing taller. I just refused to step back into the position that made her choices easier to bear. The hurt in her expression came less from what she had done, and more from the realization that guilt was not working on me anymore. She left with stiff movements as if the hallway might judge her on the way out. After the door closed, the space felt emptier, but also more like it belonged to me. For a while I moved around the apartment in small circles, waiting for the next ripple. It arrived as a call from my father. His voice carried that familiar tiredness, the sound of someone who had spent a lifetime staying neutral by looking away. He did not argue about the existence of the fund or the withdrawals. He worried about lawyers, about court, about what this would do to my mother and to Keith. Under all of it was a single hope, that I might decide it was not worth the trouble. Listening to him, I realized no one was confused about the facts anymore. They were only upset that those facts might finally come with consequences. Agreeing to handle it quietly, on their terms, would have meant accepting that my future could be treated like a family resource and then quietly forgotten. I told him I would be following the advice of the one person in this mess whose job was to protect me. That was as much as I was willing to offer. A few days later, an envelope from the court appeared in my mailbox, thin and unremarkable. Inside was a single page with a case number and a date, a time and a room in a building I had never been inside. It did not mention love, obligation, or hurt feelings. It did not care who had sacrificed what or who thought they deserved forgiveness. It simply laid out when the people who had treated my future like spare cash would have to answer for it. Holding that paper, I felt fear slide in beside a quiet, stubborn sense of rightness. For once, what they had done would not be measured by my tolerance. It would be measured against something they could not rewrite. The day of the hearing arrived with gray skies and a kind of tired light that made the courthouse steps look heavier than they were. I stood outside for a moment with the case number fresh in my mind, reminding myself that I was not walking in there as a child asking for permission. I was a person bringing proof, That thought did not erase the tremor under my skin, but it kept my feet moving. Inside the courtroom, everything felt pared down to essentials: wooden benches, a raised bench for the judge, a couple of tables for the people who were there to argue over what had already happened. My lawyer sat beside me, composed and efficient, sorting through neatly clipped documents. Across the room, my mother and Keith took their places with their own counsel. My father sat at the end of their row, shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to shrink out of the frame. Elaine found a seat behind me, quiet support in a space that did not acknowledge emotional roles. The judge did not care about the cake, the diner, or any of the words that had been thrown around in messages after. The only language that held weight there was the one printed on account forms and bank statements. One by one, my lawyer laid out the story in that dialect. He showed the paperwork my grandfather had signed establishing the fund, the designation that named me as the person the money was meant to help, the years of steady contributions, and then the sharp turn where deposits ended and withdrawals began. Each page showed the same pattern. The signatures at the bottom belonged to my mother and my uncle. The funds moved into their accounts with vague labels that never touched tuition offices or housing bills in my name. The official records from the investment company matched the copies I had taken from my father's office. There was no missing document, no hidden clause that said they could convert that money into a general family pool when it pleased them. On paper, it was straightforward. Money set aside for one purpose had been diverted elsewhere. Their side leaned hard on context. There were mentions of difficult years, unexpected expenses, pressure to keep a roof over all of our heads. They tried to paint the account as a tool they had to use, not something they had chosen to raid. The story suggested that any parent in their position would have done the same, and that love should outweigh the technicalities printed on institutional letterhead. None of that changed the numbers. The judge listened without much visible reaction, then returned again to the documents and the language written there. What mattered in that room was not how my mother felt about her sacrifices or how Keith framed his struggles. It was the clear record that funds intended for my education had been spent without my knowledge and without any attempt to replace them. The judge's decision was presented calmly, almost clinically. The account balance at the time of closure was calculated, growth that should have accrued over the years was added, and a total figure was set. They were ordered to repay that amount, on a schedule, with the understanding that if they failed, the court could place claims against their assets to collect it. Hearing it laid out like that should have felt triumphant. Instead, it landed with a heavy, quiet finality. This was not a windfall. It was a delayed attempt to restore something that should have been there from the beginning. The court did not address the years of loan payments, the interest I had already paid, or the emotional cost of realizing that the people who called themselves my safety net had cut it and walked away. Those parts were mine to carry and to work through elsewhere. In the weeks after the ruling, the fallout rippled through the family in waves. My mother's house, once a place she used as a stage to showcase control, became a location whispered about in terms of appraisals and refinancing. Keith's name began to surface in conversations about damaged credit and forced sales, instead of easy confidence and borrowed money. Relatives who had previously laughed along with their jokes started keeping a little more distance, not because they suddenly saw me differently, but because they were uncomfortable with how close those consequences had landed. My mother tried one more time to reach me, not in the hallway of my building this time, but through a letter that arrived in a thick envelope. The handwriting on the front was familiar, looping and careful. Inside, she constructed a version of events where history, necessity, and motherhood blurred into one long justification. The apology, if it was there at all, was woven so tightly into self-defense that it disappeared. I read the first few lines, felt the old pull toward making her comfortable, and then folded the pages back into themselves. The letter went into the trash, not out of anger in that moment, but because I finally accepted that I did not have to keep every story she tried to hand me. I did not call her. I did not visit. I did not show up to help sort through whatever she might have to sell to meet the repayment orders. Cutting contact was not a gesture meant to punish her. It was a boundary that should have existed long before a judge ever spoke her name. My connection to Keith disappeared just as completely. There were no dramatic confrontations, no final speeches in parking lots or hospital halls. Just a slow, deliberate decision not to step back into rooms where being related was used as an excuse to ignore harm. Life after that did not suddenly become easy. My loans did not evaporate. I still had to work, to hunt for better pay, to figure out what I wanted my future to look like now that it was not tethered to their approval. I started therapy and walked through years of patterns, not because a court told me to, but because I wanted to stop living like I was always one wrong move away from being labeled the disappointment again. Bit by bit, the idea that I was only valuable when I absorbed everyone else's choices started to loosen. If there is anything useful in this story for anyone watching, it is not that the legal system fixed everything or that standing up for yourself always ends with a clean victory. The truth is more complicated. Documents and judges can address money and orders, but they cannot make someone into the parent you needed them to be. What they can do is draw a line that says, your future is not a community fund for other people's emergencies, no matter whose last name you share. The real shift happened when I stopped waiting for my family to recognize my worth and started acting like it existed whether they saw it or not. That meant accepting that love without respect is not enough, that jokes, revealing what someone truly thinks, are not harmless, and that sometimes the only way to keep from being used up is to step away completely. I used to think protecting my family meant keeping quiet and forgiving quickly. Now I understand that the only person I was really protecting by staying silent was the one who wrote "still a disappointment" on a cake and expected me to swallow it with a smile.